First of all, you have to understand that Trump's appearance was long after the Cold War ended. And so for a period after the end of the Cold War in the early 90s, conservatives lived together but groped a bit for a new formulation. What would be the new fusionism, so to speak, for a new era? You no longer have the anti-communist component because the evil empire that Reagan called the Soviet Union had collapsed.
Welcome to Acton Line, a podcast from the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Cohn, executive producer. In this episode, Noah Gould, Acton's alumni and student programs manager, sits down with Dr. George H. Nash, senior fellow at the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/podcast. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and by leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
Well, welcome everyone. Today I am talking with Dr. George Nash on the Acton Line podcast. And Dr. Nash, we're so thankful to have you with us today.
Good to be with you.
So we're going to be talking a bit about an essay that you've written for Religion and Liberty, which is one of Acton's publications, on conservatism and its current discontents, a survey and a modest proposal. And you've written extensively on this topic, a few books. So this is a shorter treatment, but offering a little bit of a survey and then a path forward or a potential path forward for conservatism. But for some listeners who haven't heard or haven't read much of your work, can you give a little bit of an overview of fusionism or Reagan-era conservatism and what the different coalitions are in that?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. I'm the author of a book called The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America Since 1945. And as I've argued in that book, conservatism evolved from several different sources. Briefly speaking, there were libertarians and classical liberals who were concerned about the size of government and the attacks on the free economy. There were traditionalist conservatives like Russell Kirk who were worried about the decline of religion and of social institutions that conserved the best in American society and Western civilization. There were Cold Warriors who were very, very concerned about the Cold War against the Soviet Empire, communism. All of these three emerged in the decade or so after World War II, independently of one another. And they came together under one umbrella that was quite important journalistically, namely William F. Buckley's magazine, National Review, founded in 1955. A little later on, there were two more components to this grand alliance, if you will, that evolved in the decades after World War II. The Neoconservatives, who were usually former socialists or left liberals who became disillusioned with liberalism and gravitated toward the conservative camp. The way of defining them that Irving Kristol, one of their number, provided somewhat humorously was to say a neoconservative was a liberal who had been mugged by reality. And finally, in the 70s and 80s particularly, 1970s, 1980s, social conservatism arose, or as it was then called, the religious right, worried about what we now call the culture wars, the de-Christianization of the American public square, the rise of abortion on demand, and various other threats that were held to come from secular liberalism or from what secular liberalism permitted to enter the public square. So what I've just described here very briefly is 5 different components of what became a coalition that got the name conservatism in the 1950s. I didn't mention any names in the libertarian wing. I should. Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, and Milton Friedman were three of the great luminaries who promoted free market thinking in the 40s and afterward, partly in order to rescue capitalism from the bad rap it had gotten over the Great Depression. And so the libertarians and classical liberals were particularly anxious to restore an era of limited government and of relative freedom of entrepreneurship, economic freedom broadly after the lurch to the left that had occurred in much of the Western world and even in the United States in the 1930s and 40s. Now, as they came together from many different points of origin, a question arose, which leads to your question you've asked me about something called fusionism. If you look at the libertarians, their highest value was really the liberty of the individual as opposed to an overweening welfare state or tyrannical state. The social conservatives or religious right were particularly interested in maintaining not just a free society, although most of them preferred a free society to anything like what the Kremlin had in communism, but they also wanted a virtuous society. That is, a society in which Judeo-Christian values could permeate the society and provide the kind of stabilizing underpinning for a society so committed in name to freedom. Now, when you think about it, those values could be in tension with one another. And that is indeed what happened in the late 50s and 60s as these five, or really at that point 3, different rivulets started to form into a common river of thinking, to use a little bit of a metaphor there. And there were libertarians who argued that liberty was the highest value and that the purpose of government was to protect the free individual and do nothing more, certainly not try to tell the individual how to live morally. And some of the traditionalists argued, well, you can't have a free society without a good society, a moral society. And there developed quite a bit of polemics at National Review on how to reconcile these apparent polar opposites. And it fell to a former communist among the conservatives at that point, a man named Frank Meyer, who was really essentially a libertarian for the most part, I would say, to come up with a kind of middle ground. He argued that government as government is committed to protecting freedom, but that the free individual should pursue a life of virtue, a life of the good life, you see. But he did not want the state, the government, to coerce anyone on that path. Well, one of his opponents was a very militant Catholic, brother-in-law of Buckley, a man named Brent Bozell, who argued that the story of how the good society was superseded by the free society was the story, he said, of the decline of the West. And so he accused Meyer of advocating a kind of a hodgepodge that he called fusionism, a term that Meyer did not like. But as often happens in political fighting, labels like that stick. And what Meyer was trying to do was to create a kind of a consensus, or as he would really have argued, only articulate what he said was the consensus that had been part of America since its founding. Both freedom and virtue, both have their place. And that became, after a good deal of political argument, the de facto conservative consensus. And it taught the libertarians and the traditionalists at the extreme that they really needed one another. No one wanted to be in a free society that was utterly immoral and anarchic, and no one particularly wanted to be in a society so virtuous that an authoritarian regime was enforcing its version of virtue on everybody. And Meyer argued that to be virtuous, you really need to have the freedom to choose. So that became, after a time, the de facto middle road for conservatives who argued that you needed both in moderation, and each, in a sense, was a check on the excesses of the other. And fusionism then, through the Buckley era of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and on into the era of President Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, fusionism became kind of the lingua franca, really, the common vocabulary, the standard position of most conservatives. They sometimes used a different analogy, the three-legged stool. It was called freedom, social conservatism, and anti-communism. And a stool doesn't work very well unless all three legs are there. So this was a kind of a way of saying you need a coalition. Each side has something to contribute to what conservatives desire to bring about, namely a conserving of an America that is free, that is a decent place to live in, and is safe from foreign and domestic threat, particularly the threat at that time of worldwide communism. And then a little later, the disenchanted left-wingers who became neoconservatives appeared on the scene, and then the religious right got energized by Supreme Court decisions especially, and so the coalition grew into 5 parts. And really, Reagan and Buckley were ecumenical figures because they kind of personified each part of that coalition, and they gave each faction, each component, a sense of belonging as to the coalition. So that got us up to the era of Reagan and even beyond. And I think probably with that, I should let you ask a follow-up question.
Yeah, well, I find it interesting that you point out fusionism isn't just kind of this marriage of necessity of the Reagan era, but it's a much deeper idea, maybe fusing this paradox of maybe human nature or this need for both freedom to act and morality to guide our actions. I mean, that's not something that we just see in the Reagan era. Goes back to, you could think of the Apostle Paul's writings, has this paradox inside it, but then that's a thread throughout conservatism. Now, you outline how, under the era of Trump and some of the kind of popular movements, that a lot of these different assumptions or compromises are questioned. So in what way have those orthodoxies of what conservatism has been, or as people have articulated, has populism questioned those? Yes, the Trump phenomenon can be interpreted in many ways, but it really was, in intellectual terms, a rebellion against the fusionist coalition for being ineffectual in achieving what some conservatives wanted to achieve. Now, let me elaborate a bit on that. The libertarians, of course, had been best known for wanting to have a more freedom-oriented economy, a less regulated economy, a limitation on the power of government to boss the private sector, if you will. The social conservatives wanted, of course, a society in which people chose wisely and well and lived a decent, productive, and we would say for short, virtuous lives. So Trump attacked a lot of things at once. First of all, you have to understand that Trump's appearance was long after the Cold War ended. And so for a period after the end of the Cold War in the early 90s, conservatives lived together but groped a bit for a new formulation. What would be the new fusionism, so to speak, for a new era? You no longer have the anti-communist component because the evil empire that Reagan called the Soviet Union had collapsed. Now, it was still there in China, so communism did not totally disappear in the world, as we now know very well. But at that time, it looked like the West had won the Cold War. Now what's going to keep everybody together? And a point I should emphasize here is that during the rise of fusionism, one of the crucial unifying cements, if you will, that kept the movement together was the sense that they had a common external enemy in the Soviet Union. So you couldn't go off and be some kind of fanatical libertarian or fanatical traditionalist and forget that there was a very sobering enemy out there in the larger world. And so that brought conservatives, I think, a sense that they had to stick together and concentrate on some very essential projects, one of which was to prevent the communization of the world. Now, with that
the loss of that, there grew up over time a growing tendency on the right for some of these groupings to go their own way and maybe succumb, I would put it, to what I call the sectarian temptation, which is to the impulse to go it alone. You think that you have all the answers and you really don't need to have a lot of allies, so since there's no longer an external foe out there and headquartered in Moscow. But Trump came along and he argued that many people in the United States were not being fairly treated. And he found that population group, especially in some key states that helped him win the election, in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, where forgotten Americans, as he thought and argued, were being left behind by an economy that had grown under libertarian influence to be altogether too globalist and not attentive enough to the needs of rural and small-town America and places that had maybe factory towns, and then the factory moved to Mexico or somewhere else. And so he argued that you needed more protectionism, you needed more government intervention to help out such people in need. So it became a critique of the libertarian part of the coalition. Secondly, the neoconservatives after their period of particular importance in the 70s and 80s, some of them became advocates of a very assertive American foreign policy in the Middle East, Iraq in particular, and Afghanistan. And so they were accused of being Wilsonian interventionists, you see, wanting to make the whole world safe for democracy and go in and build new nations out of these ancient civilizations in the Middle East and pursue a kind of a utopian crusade. So Trump was opposed to that, and he really reflected in many ways a dissident conservative grouping that emerged in the 90s, mainly in the 90s, called the paleoconservatives, who were critics of the neoconservatives. And the paleoconservatives were particularly represented in the public sphere by Patrick Buchanan, who ran for president in 1992 and 1996, and who argued that we should think more in terms of America first, not so much about trying to transform faraway places. And so the neocons and the libertarians both became objects of criticism from Trump and then from many of his followers. And meanwhile, thirdly, the social conservatives and the religious right, some of them came to feel that for all of the huffing and puffing that had occurred in the 70s and 80s, all the lip service given to them, that they were losing ground. And in particular, the Supreme Court in some of its decisions was normalizing behavior that was antithetical to Judeo-Christian morality. And so they felt, many of them, that the conservative community was not really accomplishing much, and it wasn't fighting back hard enough against the culture war coming from the left. So and whereas Trump was portrayed as, if nothing else, a great fighter. And so he might call people names and get into Twitter wars with his foes and so forth, but they said, look, he's a fighter and we are going to take a chance on him. So Trump deviates then from the old fusionist consensus in several ways. He's more interested in using tariffs as a weapon and not going along with free market purism, if you will. He certainly wasn't in his personal life what you'd call a social conservative, but he promised to appoint people friendly to that viewpoint to the Supreme Court, and he kept his promise. So many of them say, well, whatever his faults, Trump did that much good. That's what they would say. And then the neoconservatives are still really marginalized in the Trump world as being too much internationalist, Wilsonian, globalists, et cetera, et cetera. And so Trump, of course, used the expression that Patrick Buchanan earlier had, America first. We've got to think of ourselves first. And he particularly was critical of NATO and of European countries that he thought were not paying their fair share toward the common defense under the NATO treaty. And so he made quite a fuss about that. And some of those countries, I guess, did improve their defense budgets to a certain degree. But that Trumpian viewpoint was really more representative of this paleoconservative dissent from what had been the conservative mainstream. So now we have all sorts of factions in motion. Now, when you start a game of pool, you put all the balls in the middle in a triangle, and then you bang, you hit, and they go scattering in every direction. And I sometimes think of Trump when I think of that he had the impact of challenging a lot of conventional wisdom of the conservative community existing to that point. And then, so there, instead of fusion, there was now much confusion, if I may put it that way. And then instead of fusion, there was some fission. And so now what I think I see happening as a historian of conservatism in modern times is an attempt by many different groups out there to try to reassemble the elements that have scattered, or maybe go beyond them and set up some new formulations, and to create some of them what I would call Trumpism after Trump. Not too many people would say that Trump was a great theoretician of his viewpoint. He was certainly a great promoter and advertiser. He had 85 million people on his Twitter feed before he lost the Twitter account. So he certainly was one who could make himself heard. But there were many of the more intellectual figures around him, or who came to accept him, who are now endeavoring, I think, to come up with a more coherent presentation that will appeal to people who might have been turned off by Trump's personality. So that's where I think we are now. And there are some new, quite new elements that we can discuss if you like, but I think I'll close that answer with just that observation. There's a great deal of scattering going around now, and attempts being made to find some new, if not fusionism, at least some new modus vivendi or whatever, some new face for conservatism as an intellectually substantive force.
During the Cold War, a big part of what brought these different coalitions together was opposition to communism. Do you think that there's any chance that opposition to the communism in China could bring conservatives of different stripes together in the future?
I think so. I think there's growing recognition among our foreign policy elites that China poses a very serious challenge to us economically and militarily. Its ideology suggests that it has very hegemonic aspirations. It is certainly acting that way in the South Pacific and in Eastern Africa and elsewhere. So, and I think many conservatives, including the nationalist, populist types now, some of the Trumpian folks, do see China as a threat. And I think the neocons of yore, such as they are now, would recognize that. The libertarians obviously have been associated with an ideology of global free trade, but it's not clear that the Chinese are playing fair by that in the sense that they're accused of extensive industrial espionage, for example. And so there are ways that one can critique China without necessarily adopting protectionism as an overall approach to our economy. But one of the things that COVID, along with China, have made Americans appreciate is our dependence upon China or overseas places for some very important things like medicines, medical equipment, and particularly computer chips. Taiwan is I think the world's biggest manufacturing country for computer chips. Now, if there were a war over Taiwan, or even worse, a loss of Taiwan to China, this would cause massive disruptions of the world's economy. So just from a point of national security, I think that one can justify building up more at home certain key industries or reviving them and not being dependent upon China. Now, when Reagan was president, there was a great deal done to promote a broadly libertarian approach to the economy at lower taxation, lower regulation. Some of the libertarians at the time were not happy with Reagan. They thought he was spending way too much money and he talked more than he performed in terms of cutting government spending. But Reagan, it should be noted, did not permit vital industrial technology to be traded into the Soviet bloc. So national security trumped free trade. We didn't have a perfect world of free trade because we have nation states, a world of nation states and empires even, and they can conflict with one another, and so you don't necessarily want to trade some of your most advanced equipment of military usefulness to a country like China, which could copy it, and so forth. So so national security has come back into prominence now after that post-Cold War period when it seemed that we were in a unipolar world. And what I think I see happening right now in 2022 is that there is a kind of an alliance now of Russia, China, and Iran and then you have Venezuela and certain other countries that are friendly to those first three. So there is a kind of a new Cold War afoot. It doesn't have the ideological aspect quite so much in the so clearly as did the old ideological struggle against the Soviet Union. But there is, I think, a unifying component on that. And, of course, the treatment of the Uyghurs by China, I mentioned the industrial espionage, and then their very overbearing behavior toward places like Australia and South Pacific Islands, and pressure against Japan and South Korea, Philippines, and so on. All of that has made American conservatives of many stripes realize that this has got to be a major issue on the agenda. And so I don't think we're going back to some kind of pure libertarianism if we ever had quite that much pure libertarianism, because the nature of the geopolitical scene is such that there will probably be some adjustments that have to be made. But I do think that there's a general recognition now on the right that China has to be confronted. Now, there may be argument as how to do that, especially about whether we remove tariffs or impose tariffs and so forth. But it seems to me now that in fact, I think a lot of conservatives, particularly of the nationalist populist side, consider China to be the real threat, and they're not so eager to force the issue on the Ukraine front. It's almost like some of them would see that as a secondary matter, Putin versus Ukraine, and want to concentrate more on the other threat coming from Asia.
So another common thread in a lot of these coalitions, or I think really all of them, is this idea of American exceptionalism, that America is in some way a unique project. So I'm wondering, there are some conservative groups now who would question that idea. So do you think that there is room in kind of conservatism broadly for groups that don't kind of believe in American exceptionalism?
Well, they're on the landscape and they circulate in conservative media and so forth. So to that extent, they're simply, as a matter of fact, part of the landscape. I find it hard to think that the integralists who want a kind of integration of church and state and perhaps moving in a direction where the government would really act with considerable authority to promote a more virtuous society, I don't see that they have much possibility of doing that in such a society that we have, which not only has some de-Christianizing tendencies, but also where those who are Christian, Catholic included, are not really likely to rally to Catholic integralism, which is something that really, you might say, has European roots essentially in the 19th century. It's so far from the American historical experience that I don't see it as having politically a lot of potential. As someone said, that probably most American Catholics wouldn't even go along with the idea that somehow you're going to unite the church and state, with the church taking over, the function of tutoring the state and how to establish the Christian moral code as the church institution interprets it and so forth. So I don't see that as a very likely prospect for the great masses of the American people. However, it is intellectually different, and it's intriguing to some, and it is causing a certain amount of buzz in conservative circles, especially younger conservative circles. And I'm told that many or a number of younger Catholics who have been mortified by certain Supreme Court decisions in recent years that this has some appeal. So that's one point. Now, the very recent Supreme Court decision on abortion may take some of the wind out of the sails of the integralists, because now you have an institution in our society, the Supreme Court, which may be circumscribing some of the anarchic, if you will, tendencies of pagan secularism, if I may use such verbiage. Now, the National Conservatives are another element, and they are arguing, as I understand it, that the nation-state is a vital institution in this world. It long has been, and so they argue for various ways to maintain America as a viable nation-state. That has some resonance. But sometimes it seems like they're drawing upon sources far away. And so I think it's very important, and I can expand on this a bit later if you like. I think it's very important that conservatives remember that if they're going to call themselves conservatives in America, they have to speak in vocabulary that makes sense to the great mass of the American people. It probably doesn't help expand their sphere of influence if they start talking in language of continental European conservatism or of Catholic integralism of a certain era. That is not likely to be, politically very effective. It's just so foreign from the general trend of the American experience. So they need to come to grips with and define and in what ways America is exceptional, and then defend that, it would seem to me.
So you're starting to hint at maybe a way forward for maybe a realignment of conservatism. Where do you see some possibilities for realignment, or maybe a new coalition or new alliances? Well, first I would say that conservatism has been built over the years, if you think about fusionism, partly by refugees from the left, people who had been left-wing and became conservatism even then. I'm thinking of ex-communists like Whittaker Chambers, who became a prominent conservative figure in the 1950s, and a number of other names of they're lesser known of that era, who had flirted with the left or been communists or Trotskyists and so on, and then they came out of that. So now it seems to me that there are what I call dissident liberals out there, a prominent name, particularly at the moment, a leading blogger, a podcast, or she has a Substack platform, which is very popular. Bari Weiss, former New York Times editor, editorial page person, and she's become pretty well known in the last year or so. She calls herself a liberal, an old-fashioned liberal. She's not a social conservative particularly, no, but she is spending her time particularly criticizing the illiberal left, the illiberal progressives. Now, she sees, as some of these others do,
two threats. One from the illiberal right, those who would turn to Europe and maybe talk vaguely about authoritarian projects or what sound like them. But also authoritarianism on the illiberal left, wokeism, and this cancel culture, which seems to be bent on driving out conservative voices out of the public sphere, particularly academe. So I think that the rise of a number of liberals who are still in their minds liberals, but who are opposed to the farther left, that is a phenomenon of note, and it might lead some of them to move in a even more conservative direction. So you might say potentially a new wave of neoconservatism. We'll see. And if you're a conservative, there are certain areas where I think one can cooperate as a conservative with dissident liberals, and in particular in defense of civility and a free-thinking culture, a culture of freedom of thought, on a place that it ought to exist without having to work for it, namely colleges and universities. So I think there are alliances building in that area, including a group I might mention called the Academic Freedom Alliance, which consists of both liberals and conservatives who've been set up now as an organization to help embattled professors fight the kind of intolerance and worse that they're finding on the left inside academia. So that's one thing. And if I may mention a second one, Noah, it seems to me that this wokeism and cancel culture and transgender discussion and so on is turning some people of socially conservative views in minority communities, Hispanics and blacks, turning them away from that kind of post-Christian, neo-pagan, secular left. And so some of those folks are seeming to gravitate now toward the Republican Party, which is an imperfect vehicle of conservatism, but it is the alternative. So I would say that there is some possibility of that happening. And I think there are efforts being made now as a kind of pushback against this wave of denigration of America and its symbols and its hero figures that came in the last 2 years. In this, the destruction of monuments, for example, of Washington and Lincoln and others, and this tendency now that seems to be omnipresent to reinterpret everything in American history negatively. I just read recently a couple of articles on the way that Monticello is being presented by the guides there. People visiting Jefferson's Monticello, and the same thing is happening up the road at Madison's mansion by guides there, and it turns out that the guides are emphasizing the negative features of that world, namely the existence of slavery, and certainly not to be ignored. But to the point, it seems that they're not mentioning anything positive or noble that Jefferson and Madison accomplished. And so it seems like every figure of previous high reputation in American history now is getting reinterpreted in a way that it seems excessive and fanatical. And what is happening on the right in many places now is a pushback and much more emphasis on civic education and saying, look, America, like every country, has its flaws and it has its failures in the record, and that has to be taught by any kind of truthful historical study. And but that's not the whole story, and that there is much that Americans can be proud of, and in terms of what they have stood for among the nations and what they've done among the nations. And I think that to me is a very encouraging sign that more and more organizations are on the right are devoting themselves now to civic education for two reasons. One, because they sense great civic illiteracy, lack of knowledge, ignorance of our history among the part of of the Generation Z and the millennials, younger generations. So there's a vacuum to be filled intellectually there. And secondly, they are saying that we need civic education simply to rebalance the story here. It's gotten far too negative, and too many of the criticisms are really not valid historically, or they need to be greatly qualified. So we got into kind of a rut here of turning very disparagingly on our past, or I say we, I'm speaking now more of some people out there on the academic and political left, particularly in the wake of our upheavals of the last couple of years. So I think we've gone too far, and now there is a kind of return, or an attempted return to a more balanced viewpoint, so that the Americans can say, yes, there is much that America has stood for that has been beneficial to us and to millions and millions of people in our society and beyond. So I think that is a hopeful sign. We'll see how far it goes, but there are, as I've just enumerated, a few examples of what seems to be the possibilities here of moving in a more constructive and balanced direction.
Well, that's certainly an uplifting look into the future and a path forward for conservatism. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was a pleasure to have a discussion with you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed it.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Eric Cohn.